Welcome. This is a recording for Feminist Philosophy at Las Positas College. The topic is one from our review. So we'll be talking about feminist concepts of gender. These have been reviewed for you already in the notes. What you're seeing now takes from those notes and expands on them somewhat. So the reading here is from Haslanger, and it's some of the more conceptual work that we did. It's some of the work that the students have the hardest time understanding. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here reviewing it for you. So Haslanger points out that there are at least three ways of asking, what is gender? You remember from before that the distinction between sex and gender is just that sex is about anatomy, physiology, morphology. It's what you're born with. And the idea of gender is that it's more of a social role that you play. Your sex, male or female, your anatomy, and when it comes to the concept of gender, this is the social role of man or woman, or in adjectival form, this is what it means to be masculine or feminine. So what do we mean by gender? What defines gender? One thing we might start with is a conceptual analysis. The conceptual analysis of gender asks questions like, well, what do we mean by the terms man, woman, or masculine, feminine? In other words, what elements go into the concept that we already have? How do we do this kind of analysis? We do this kind of analysis by getting clear on what the words mean that we already use. The concept is already there. Sometimes we use it imprecisely. Maybe we look into a dictionary to see the precise definition, or maybe we just sit down clearly and ask, what does that term really mean? Here's an example. Think about something like justice. Plato, the philosopher, famously argued that you could never get the concept of justice by doing something like looking down at the world. We'll see this is called descriptive analysis. Plato says no matter how much you look at the world, no matter how much you look at the ways in which various societies are organized or various people act, you're never going to see true justice. True justice doesn't exist down here in the real world. So if we want to know what true justice is like, we can't look down. Instead, we have to get the concept from some higher source. So, Plato argues, if you want to know what true justice is, then you have to be working off the idea of justice. The idea of justice is in fact necessary to show us that the supposed justice that we see on earth is not truly just. So Las Positas College tries to be just. The criminal justice system tries to be just. A judge tries to be just. But each one of these institutions and persons has to be evaluated relative to some higher source. And for Plato, that higher source is just the true idea of justice. So what about a concept like gender? What it means to be a man or a woman? What it means to be masculine or feminine? A conceptual analysis of this would say, well, what do we truly mean by the word man and woman? What's built into the concept as we have it already? You can see some limitations with this view because most feminists are going to say, well, the notion of man and woman that we have already, let's say it includes women being supportive and men being assertive, women doing things around the house, and men doing things outside of the house. Most feminists are going to want to challenge the concept we already have, to ask if it's really a necessary concept, to ask if it's a useful concept. So most feminists won't want to analyze gender just by looking at the idea that we already have, because they think that idea is biased, and not necessarily applicable. Not that we ignore the idea that we already have, but it's not going to be sufficient to define how we should think of gender. So Haslanger goes on from there to descriptive analysis. A descriptive analysis of gender asks, what do those who are identified as men and those who are identified as women have in common? What we mean by this is not what do men and women, when put together, have in common, but what does the first group have in common, setting it aside as women? What does the second group have in common, setting that group aside as men? So in this case, we take the actual observed facts of the members of a group to define the meaning of that term. Now, for a lot of things, this kind of descriptive analysis is obviously going to be the correct way to define something. Unlike justice, it would be very strange to get the definition of horse using conceptual analysis, right? Because you don't understand what a horse is, define a horse by thinking about the nature of horseness. There's not some pre-existing idea which informs us about a horse. So we don't do conceptual analysis. We're much more likely instead to do descriptive analysis. Descriptive analysis means we look at those things we've already classified as having something in common, being horses, and we say, okay, what's the nature of these animals? What do they have in common that allows us to define a horse as separate from a llama or an alpaca? So maybe a horse is taller, it has shorter hair, it runs faster, and every horse has, 4 hooves, unless something's gone wrong. It has a mane, it eats grass. So we define a natural kind like horse more obviously descriptively than just from the idea, the way we might define justice. Remember, we define justice from the idea because true justice doesn't exist on earth. Plato at least argued. On the other hand, we might define horse by looking at horses because that's the only way to get a true notion of what a horse actually is. It doesn't come just from an idea. Another example given by Saul Kripke, a famous example, is water. Kripke argues that you can only get a true understanding of what water is, you can only understand the nature of water or even define water by breaking it up into its chemical constituents. Once you find that water is hydrogen combined with oxygen, you realize that's the essence of water, but you didn't get that from thinking about water. You got the essence of water by observing it. So, should we define gender in this way? What will a feminist say? Well, basically what it would entail to define gender through descriptive analysis would be to take the men, take women, put them into 2 separate groups, and then think, well, what is it that men have in common such that they are men, and women such that they are women? Remember, we're not dealing with the concept of sex here, which would mean what's their anatomy, physiology, but the concept of a social role. Well, how successful will that be from a feminist point of view? Well, somewhat successful, right? You can only really define a term by seeing how it applies in the world. But at the same time, when we look at what men are doing now and what women are doing now, there will be some problems. For example, not all men and women, especially if you compare culture to culture, are going to be behaving in the same way. What if some of the ways in which men and women are behaving, they're sort of forced by social expectations to behave in that way? Man and woman is not a natural kind in the same way water is, where it's defined just by its chemical constituents. Man and women behave in the way they do, at least in part, because it's their social role, because of things like choice and influence and cultural expectation. So ultimately, Haslanger wants to say that at least part of our definition has to come down to an analytical notion of gender. So how does the analytical definition work? Here we're not just asking, well, what's the idea we already have, which might have some biases built into it, not just what do men and women actually do, which is going to be culturally contingent and sometimes forced and not always a matter of choice, not always thought through, but also what concept of gender, if any, should we develop. Now for some words we decide what we want them to mean, at least in part. Can't just define them randomly, but choices are made by how we choose to think as a society. What counts as legal or what counts as polite. Politeness doesn't just exist out there, right? Politeness is what we decide we're going to accept, and it's going to be different from culture to culture. If you went to a formal wedding wearing bare feet, that would be considered impolite, but that's just a cultural fact. It doesn't have to be that way in every society, every culture. So not all meaning has to be determined by what people do now. That's the descriptive definition, nor by what we already think. That's the analytical definition, but by what we decide is best for society. So a good example of this might be something like marriage. We have a concept of marriage that's important. So thinking about marriage, we know marriage is in part about commitment and unity and things like that, right? That would be the conceptual analysis of marriage. And there's also a descriptive element to it. If we want to understand marriage, at least one thing we want to do is look at people who are married and see what that looks like. But marriage is also a legal and a social contract, which means that not everything about marriage can be decided just by the idea of it or just by what we already do. So part of the question is going to be this analytical question of, well, what's best for society? What's most in line with our social ideals? What do we choose to make marriage mean? Because marriage is, at least in part, defined by a set of laws. Those laws are created by us as a community, usually at the state level primarily, right? And so it's not something we can pull from some other source because it's what we determine we want our rules to be. So questions about things like gay marriage can't just be, well, what are we doing now? Because it can't just be questions about what are we doing now, because if it's just about what we're doing now,